right, good morning, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I appreciate the invitation by Tim O'Connell to come and tell you a little bit about how I arrived at my career at the University of St. Thomas, which, as was mentioned before, is a primarily undergraduate institution in St. Paul, Minnesota. So my career visualization is a little bit different, but same idea. So I started out at the University of Kansas. I got my undergraduate degree in 2000. In biology, and as an undergraduate, I just fell in love with animal behavior, and I wanted to learn more about the underlying mechanisms of animal behavior. So I hooked up with a man named Chip Taylor, who is responsible, to kind of reiterate this idea of life-changing mentors, was my life-changing mentor. So he gave me the opportunity. We're all here because we had professors in college that gave us a chance to do research. He gave me mine, and he also gave me an opportunity to teach. So at the University of Kansas, they hired undergraduates into usually freshman and sophomore biology labs to function like a graduate teaching assistant. So very early on in my career, I got dual exposure and seeds planted for a career in both research and teaching. I'm also, I should admit, an academic brat. Both my parents were professors. So the idea of an academic career was very clear to me from the very beginning. And that, even as, even as an undergraduate, was something that I knew I really wanted to do. Even though that was true, I also was young, and I wanted to, I wanted to do something before I went straight to graduate school. And that's, people take different paths. This was my detour. I went out to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is an amazing place, and worked for a year at a place called the Teton Science School. And it's this wonderful institution focused on experiential education. So I got to take as young as 5-year-old kids out in the field, teach them about science, with the Grand Tetons as our backdrop, and a real deep passion for teaching, and not just teaching, but innovative pedagogy, unique approaches to learning is what got sort of laid down as a foundation there. And I ran back to Chip Taylor, because he's my mentor, and spent some time working with him in a different part of his research, managing a tagging program. So it's this beautiful mark recapture program, trying to understand how monarch butterflies find their way to and from Mexico every year. And it was this huge 25-year research project. And I loved that, and I realized that I really, truly missed the opportunity to do in-depth research. So did, as all of you have done, send off applications to major institutions for a PhD program, and landed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the laboratory of Dr. Lauren Reeders. And she's another life-changing mentor. It's really true. You need to find people who see the world the way that you see it, and can speak to you honestly and clearly about how to grow and develop as a scientist. So I became a bird brain expert. I study the neuroendocrinology of social behavior in songbirds. So I studied vocal communication in her lab. And I was, not to sound like a blowhard, but pretty successful. I got NSF funding, I got good publications, landed a good postdoc at the University of British Columbia. I was there for 4 years, got good funding there as well, good publication rate. And throughout both of those experiences, I did a fair amount of teaching, but you immerse yourself in research and, as a graduate student and postdoc. So I kind of stepped away from that teaching approach, but it was this fire that had gotten lit when I was quite young, and as I was considering various career options, I knew I wanted teaching to be a big part of my career. So when I applied for jobs, I applied, you just cast as wide of a net as you possibly can. But when I got the interview at St. Thomas and when I visited the campus, I knew that it was the kind of job for me. So I arrived there in 2012, and I've been there ever since. I put in my tenure portfolio next fall. It's very nerve-wracking. It feels like when you finish graduate school that you're done proving yourself, but then you get into all these later stages, you're like, no, you never finish trying to prove yourself. So my job, 40-40-20, tells you that my job is supposed to be 40% research, 40% teaching, and 20% service. It feels like 100, 100, 100 some days, which is fine. It's why I took the job. I teach 6 courses per year. Before you, kind of look at each other and say, that's not for me. What that breaks down at St. Thomas, at every semester I teach 1 course and then 2 labs that accompany that course. So it's integrated, at least at St. Thomas. It's N of 1 in terms of PUI experience here, so I can't say that this is true for all PUIs, but it's a relatively balanced teaching load, very time consuming. You, especially these days, you find yourself as a substitute. These kids, students, have helicopter parents, and you become a surrogate helicopter parent. At least the students at St. Thomas can be kind of needy sometimes. So you have, and I've never had a faculty job at an R1 institution, but there are students in and out of my office all day long, and that's part of the job. You're sort of expected to be available to your students, especially at a PUI. I have a pretty substantial advising load, and that's a piece that you don't necessarily appreciate until you do it. I have 40 undergraduate advisees. I see them at least twice a year for at least a half an hour. Again, surrogate helicopter parent, it's often more than that. So that was the one piece that I wasn't prepared for when I entered this job, but I love it, right? You get to sit and have these one-on-one conversations and become perhaps that foundational mentor that somebody like Chip Taylor was for me. I do have a pretty active research program. I have a decent-sized lab. In fact, don't tell my postdoc advisor, but the real estate I have for my research lab is bigger than the one he has at UBC. And this, I'll get to the pros and cons. You know, while I try to actually integrate some of my own research into my teaching, the labs that I put together for my courses, but the bulk of the research that I do is in the summer. I'm on a 9-month contract, so I do it for free, so to speak. Okay, so if you want to have this job, I suggest that you become, or you are already, equally passionate about teaching and research. I personally was really invested in, and I would like to think pretty successful at both, and I want to think that that's what made my application stand out when I applied for this job. The unsolicited advice from my postdoc advisor, this was actually a turning point for me in my career, so I think I'd been probably 2 or 3 years into my postdoc. My postdoc advisor was very protective of his time. So if you had a 15-minute meeting, when 15 minutes were up, whether you were in the middle of a sentence or not, he would escort you out the door. Very protective of his time. And he came to me one day and he knocked, "Sarah, can I talk to you?" "Yes, of course." He said, "You know, I'm very worried about you in your career." And of course, I sit bolt upright and my stomach drops down. And he says, "Well, I'm very worried that when you get a faculty job, you're going to spend too much time with your students. So you need to think about that." And walks on out of my office. And I've always been a rule follower. I didn't get into trouble. So I was like, okay, all right, how do I figure out how to spend less time with my students? Spent the whole afternoon sort of puzzling over it. Went home and told my husband what Dr. Soma had said. And Eric looked at me and he said, "No, if that's what you want to do, that's what you should do." So that's what I did. I got a career where I could, where I was rewarded, I was expected to spend time with students. So what are the pros of this job? The pros of this job are that I do get to spend time with students. I get to have lots of one-on-one conversations, make sure they're understanding the material, understanding its application, understanding how they can move their learning forward. I have a fair amount of freedom, and I can't say this is true for all PUIs, but every semester my chair comes to me and says, "What do you want to teach next semester?" It's wonderful. I get to I've created 2 classes out of nothing. They weren't on the books when I got there, and now they're what I do all day. I also have freedom with respect to research. While there is really strong institutional and cultural support for research at St. Thomas, my career doesn't depend on extramural funding, which means I'm not locked in to a single line of research potentially for the next 20 or 30 years of my life. I've dabbled already pre-tenure, which I think at an R1 institution, my colleague can correct me if I'm wrong, but is not advisable pre-tenure to sort of see what else might work in your career. And again, the idea that my career doesn't depend on extramural funding, I'm not expected necessarily, they want me to apply, but I'm not expected to land a big, R01 grant in order to receive tenure at St. Thomas. And I do think that my life, most of the time, is pretty well balanced, both between research and teaching, and then also work and life. I have rediscovered hobbies, long neglected hobbies, that I had before I started graduate school. I have a child, she's 5, and we get to I pick her up and drop her off from daycare every day. I don't send emails at 4 a.m. like my mentors did when I was a postdoc and a graduate student, unless I have a small bout of insomnia, and then who knows. The cons of this job: teaching and advising load is no joke. It really is equal, 50-50 in my life. My research collaborators are primarily undergraduates, and we can all remember when we were undergraduates, we were invested in research, but, right? So it's really important, and we can talk more about this in the breakout sessions, that you identify pieces of your research that are undergraduate friendly, right? Or you develop redundancies in your tissue samples or whatever they might be, so that when that novice researcher comes in and despite their best efforts screws everything up, your effort is not completely lost. Research momentum does get lost. Like I said, it's predominantly in the summer. So by mid to late July, we're really cooking with gas. About 4 weeks later, everybody's off and starting classes, and I don't see my students again for research for about 9 months. So I try to keep fan the flames, but the reality is that it's really quite difficult. The last thing that I would say is a con of this job is that I am the only behavioral neuroendocrinologist at the University of St. Thomas. So I don't have that person I can go knock on the door and say, hey, let's go grab a coffee. I want to bounce some research ideas off of you. Because that's key, I think, to sometimes the most innovative research ideas that you can have. And I miss that. I miss that a lot. I have a colleague over in psychology who does neuroendocrinology of addiction, and so we found a way to talk to each other. It's a close enough colleague that we can help each other out. So if you want to get a job at a PUI, at a primarily undergraduate institution, this is my advice for you. Teach. And I know that you don't have the time to, but try to find the time to teach. Guest lecturing in your mentor's classes is great. Well, I said good. Better would be to have a longer-term investment in your teaching opportunities, a semester-long TA, or maybe jump into an entire unit of a course that your mentors or other people in the department might have going on. But the best thing, the thing that would really, when I've been on a couple search committees, when we see that somebody has actually had ownership of an entire course, that is delightful. We know that they have that, they're going to hit the ground running, and they know what it means to be an undergraduate educator. Seek out whatever training opportunities with respect to teaching that you can find, especially if you just can't get that meaty teaching experience at your institution. So if your institution has one, check out the faculty development office. There's often workshops that are going on to help you become innovative in your teaching pedagogy. At conferences like this, there are often teaching workshops. Attend those, and then make sure they're on your CV so that when people are evaluating your application, they can see that throughout your training, you have sought out wherever you can the opportunity to learn how to be a better teacher. At the University of Minnesota, there's a wonderful program called Preparing Future Faculty. If you attend the University of Minnesota, get involved in that program, or look out for programs like that at your own institutions. And we'll talk about this more in the breakout, but make sure you tailor your application materials to a PUI. When we get applications and the cover letter reads like an R1 cover letter, the research statement reads like an R1 research statement, we think, oh, is this somebody's safety net, or is this really truly where they want to be? Be authentic in all of those materials. Make sure that you're conveying wherever you can that what you want to do in your job is at least 50% teaching. In fact, I would say use your research statement not to necessarily, if you're applying to a job like St. Thomas, a job at a place like St. Thomas, make sure your research statement reads like you are trying to help the audience understand what you're actually doing. That's how, when I read applications, that's what I do. I go to the research statement first, and I say, is this person actually trying to communicate the really complicated biochemistry and molecular biology of their research and make it understandable to me? I don't do much of that, right? So use that opportunity. But don't neglect your research, all right? It's unfortunate, maybe or not. In these jobs, we expect people to be well-trained in both, successful in both. It's sort of the best of both worlds, and then maybe the worst of both worlds, depends on how you think about it. So that's all I have to say, but I look forward to questions afterwards.